Our next panel is going to talk about a very exciting project that's part of our Babson Global division. As you may know, Babson Global division is a wholly owned subsidiary of Babson College, and they function as a laboratory for us, as a place where we undertake more hands-on activities in the college, where we really take the entrepreneurial thought and action to the action stage and help people achieve things around the world that are enormously entrepreneurial and very new. And one of the new things, one of the new trends that we have been exploring is how we might, as a college, encourage more entrepreneurship in new cities. Many of you may know that one of the leading global trends that's projected for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years into the future is urbanization. It's said that there's 1.5 million new people moving to cities every single day around the world. And you've probably read also that leaders like Prime Minister Modi in India have said that they need to establish 100 new cities in India alone to accommodate the movement of people from rural areas into urban areas. And you can see pretty easily in many communities here in Latin America and also in Asia, what happens if you don't have new cities. You see the poor accumulating around the periphery of larger communities, larger cities, to become mega cities. And they often end up in slum situations, and it is increasing the pain of poverty around the world, that we haven't thought very thoughtfully and clearly about how do we create functional urban environments for everyone, so that when people are, as they inevitably will be, moving from an agricultural society into an urban environment, what will that urban environment look like? And so one of the things we've been talking about now with our partners around the world is e-cities. That's what we're calling e-cities, but basically it's new cities around the world. How, when these new cities are being established, what will they look like? How will they be financed? What will life be like for the people who move to those cities in the different economic strata? And how can we, as Babson, have a positive influence on the decisions that are being made by governments and developers as they begin these new cities? You probably all have read about cities in China that were built and there's no one there. There's no commerce. There's nothing happening in them. They're very frightening, actually, when you see them. They seem like ghost towns. So they exist, but they don't work as cities. So the challenge that we've been thinking about and working with partners to discuss is how do you create cities that attract investment, attract entrepreneurs, and are fair and socially conscious for the people who are moving toward them. So with that in mind, I'd like to welcome Shanker Singham to the rostrum with us as well. And I apologize. And we are also welcoming today, I apologize, Erick, Brimen, who is class of 06, which is apparently our most outstanding class in recent time. Everyone seems to be from the class of 06. And Erick is a partner at NeWAY. And he is financing new cities and thinking about how the cities could be put together. So we're looking forward to having a conversation with both Shanker and Erick about these new projects.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kerry. We are keeping you between lunch and flights and so on, so we will try to do this quickly, building a new city as quickly as we can. So the Competitiveness and Enterprise Cities project at Babson Global is designed to deal with problems. So what are the problems that we're trying to deal with? The biggest problem we're trying to deal with is poverty, as Kerry mentioned, poverty in the world. And you've got some poverty statistics there. You heard last night an eloquent presentation about poverty in the world. 3 billion people living on less than $2.50 a day. Raj Sisodia on Saturday talked about extreme poverty, which is $1.25 as defined by the UN and the World Bank. But $2.50 a day, that number of people living in absolute poverty goes up to 3 billion people. 5.6 billion people, 80% of the world, living on less than $10 a day. 2.6 billion, no access to sanitation. 29% of the world's children, 2.2 billion children, living without shelter. Very little access to electricity around the world in developing countries, emerging markets. But we have some good success stories. We have 600 million people lifted out of poverty in China in the last 20 years. And the poverty rate in China has fallen from 85% to 15.9%. So there are success stories as well. Now, this poverty affects people in different ways, and it particularly affects women. So 2/3 of the 785 million illiterate people in the world are women. So what's the context for enterprise cities? Our project is competitiveness and enterprise cities. So we're looking at the legal, economic, and regulatory environment that exists primarily in developing countries and emerging markets. And we're looking at extreme poverty on the one hand, and as Kerry mentioned, we're looking at massive urban migration. So you have hundreds of millions of people, billions of people moving from the countryside to the city every year. We've actually crossed the Rubicon. We have more people now living in cities than live in the countryside for the first time ever in human history. Now, you also have a huge infrastructure demand, $57 trillion of infrastructure demand, and countries can't, using old methods of financing, finance this kind of infrastructure demand. So the private sector has to be engaged in this process. But you also have $30 trillion of capital on the sidelines, not being spent. My prior history was head of global market access at a couple of large global law firms. We represented clients like Intel and Microsoft and DHL and so on. Intel at one point had $100 billion cash on its balance sheet, unable to spend it anywhere, because the regulatory environments were not good in the world, because of a lack of investor trust, and so you have this problem of cash on the sidelines, huge infrastructure need. How can you marry these two together using this megatrend that is going on in the world of massive and increased urbanization? So 90% of global capital goes to 12 countries. And the World Bank has done a number of studies on this, despite the fact that better returns are available, far better returns are available in developing markets. So why is that happening? Well, we've done a lot of work on the area of the actual regulatory, legal, and economic environment in countries around the world. And we believe that it's a lack of a level playing field for competition. It's a lack of property rights protection. It's a lack of open trade that is creating economic distortions. My background, and I'll take you back to Raj Sisodia's presentation on Saturday morning, was very much starting with the privatization of the UK electricity industry in the late 80s, and then the privatizations in the former Soviet Union in the early 90s after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the opening in Latin America in September 92. And I think in that period, as countries came into the global economic environment, we saw two things happen reasonably well. We saw open trade, and we saw property rights protection increase in countries around the world. But the missing piece of this, the third pillar, is competition on the merits, a level playing field for competition. And competition is critical for entrepreneurship. It's critical for new insurgent companies. In too many countries, regulatory environments, legal environments favor incumbent companies. They favor the large players, and they prevent entrepreneurial companies from being successful. And that's particularly true in emerging markets and developing countries. Because there was a failure in that piece of the economic puzzle, it made national level reform much, much more difficult to accomplish. So what we were seeing in the 2000s and towards the end of the 2000s was national level reform of things like protecting intellectual property, things like moving to more flexible labor markets, increasing competition in energy, in telecom. We heard a presentation this morning about regulatory barriers in telecoms and competing with the government and what that's like, you know, when you have to compete with the government. But in many countries, the beneficiaries of distortion were much strengthened. They were able to block national level reform and prevent the very kinds of regulatory reforms that are necessary to create economic growth in all of our countries. So national level reform is becoming very difficult to achieve. And so our thought in the Competitiveness and Enterprise Cities project was, can we take all of these megatrends and try to solve this huge problem of poverty, of a lack of infrastructure, and can we put this all together? And so the concept is essentially, let's look at these new cities that are being created all over the world anyway. 500 new cities being created in China, 100 in India, cities being created all over the world. Let's look at those and see what kind of better environment can be provided for investment, for entrepreneurs, for people who are engines of economic activity. And can we learn from some of the examples that exist in the world where you do have some, you know, very powerful growth engines? Hong Kong, for example. In Hong Kong, after 1997 with the handover to China, Hong Kong had to convince the investment community that its regulatory environment was not going to change, that China was not going to change the environment. And immediately after handover, the value of land in Hong Kong actually went down. The investment community was concerned about this, and the way Hong Kong solved that problem is with the Basic Law, which is a regulatory framework agreement for Hong Kong, agreed by the Chinese government and the authorities in Hong Kong. Singapore was thrown out of the Malaysian Federation in 1965 within a very short period of time, largely because of the use of English common law and other regulatory differences from the surrounding area. Singapore became a powerful economic engine. In fact, right now, Singapore is one of the top 6 cities in the world. So there are 6 cities in the world that have essentially left all other cities in terms of economic performance. And those are the ones you'd expect: London, New York, Paris, Tokyo, but Hong Kong and Singapore are the other 2. And they are orders of magnitude different from other cities around the world. So I talked about London. You might wonder, well, London's pretty old. Why is London on this slide? Well, the city of London, the square mile, the financial district of London itself, is under a different regulatory environment. It is an enterprise city. It has a different financial set of regulations. It is run by a corporate board. It has, in fact, a chief lobbyist who is it could only happen in the City of London. He's called the Remembrancer. And what he does is he protects the City of London, the financial freedoms in the City of London, from encroachment by foreign governments. Foreign governments for these purposes include Brussels, obviously, but also Westminster. And the City of London had an appointed MP until 1944, not elected, an appointed MP, to protect the regulatory system in the City of London, which is obviously a huge economic generator for the world, but for the UK in particular. And then, of course, where you're going next year, Dubai, created very much out of nothing, designed as an air hub primarily, brought in trade finance, brought in financial services as a result of that, and was very, very effective. These are all places that are characterized by enormous amounts of entrepreneurial energy. They're governed by regulatory systems that deliver open trade, property rights protection, and the rule of law, merit-based competition that creates an environment where insurgent companies can actually be successful. So there's nothing in the way of an entrepreneur's vision and dreams. We heard some amazing stories about that this morning. But there's nothing in the way of what you want to do except your own ideas, the capability of your own ideas, and the willingness to commit hard work and to commit labor to realize your vision and your dreams. Well, in developing countries and emerging markets, there are many barriers to that. Lack of access to financial capital, very inflexible labor markets, very high cost of inputs, energy in particular, in many countries is very, very high, much higher than it is in developed countries. And so, can we develop the kinds of regulatory systems that lower developing country risk, at least in these zones? and create an environment that is inviting for capital, for investment, both foreign investment and domestic investment, and create an environment where entrepreneurs can flourish. So that's the sort of problem side. You know, these are the problems. So how do we actually do this? Well, we connect governments with developer groups and other stakeholders, international development agencies, others, who want to do this kind of work. And many of these cities are actually being built around the world right now. So, for example, you know, without us, Duqm in Oman is building a special economic zone that creates a different regulatory environment, recognizing that they're competing with Dubai and recognizing that they're competing with some other places in the region. They're creating a zone where many of the barriers and the impediments to growth in Oman are eliminated just in the zone. So the way we do this, and our special expertise, is really in the area of trade and competition, and what are the barriers, the economic barriers, the legal barriers to growth. So we identify the constraints to economic activity, and I've named a few of them, but there are obviously many. We advise the elimination of those constraints inside the zone. And again, it's much easier for governments to do that. The nationwide reform is the first best solution. That's what people want to do, but they find that very difficult to do. In a zone, you can actually do some of those reforms. You can create demonstration models where you actually show people the results of actually creating an economic environment that is conducive to growth, the Hong Kongs, the Singapores, the Dubais. And then we facilitate the creation of a regulatory system that actually delivers economic growth. So I was recently at the Global Competitiveness Forum in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, and we have a project with King Abdullah Economic City in Saudi Arabia. And the head of the zone in Saudi Arabia was asked, well, what's your investor proposition? What's your offering? Why would people come to this place? And he talked about subsidies, and he talked about the tax breaks, and he talked about the access in geographic terms. But that's not really good enough to create real economic activity. You have to show investors that there's a level playing field for competition, that property rights are protected, and you have an open trading environment. So in this context, we work with a number of people who you would expect us to work with. The World Bank Group, obviously, the IFC, is advising on a lot of this work. OPIC is the Overseas Private Investment Corporation in the US. OPIC does debt financing for developers who are building projects like this. OPIC is anxious to change that dynamic, that the global capital is all going to 12 countries. They want to see more institutional capital going to developing countries. And the key to doing that is lowering the levels of risk in those countries. The Millennium Challenge Corporation we're working with on our project in Morocco. The Millennium Challenge Corporation is giving a $500 million grant to Morocco, which will be signed in September or October of this year. And part of that grant will be used to create the initial stages of an enterprise city, to seed an enterprise city in Morocco, and I'll say something about it in a second. USAID, and then the European Commission and the US government. What's the timeline? How do you build this? And I want to talk a little bit about ETA and how we apply entrepreneurial thought and action to building this, because obviously this is a huge undertaking. We focus on the soft infrastructure piece. What are the conditions that will create economic activity? We don't build the whole city. We have other people who do that. But how do we break this down into manageable pieces, and how do we make it easy for people to engage with us? Well, first of all, people have to know, developers have to know that the government is actually willing to do something. So most countries in the world, many countries in the world, may not be willing to do something like this. So we're talking to about 12 or 13 countries around the world, and we've signed in Morocco and in Bosnia, we've signed letters of intent, memorandum of understanding, where the government says, we are willing to look at this idea. We are willing to commit to do a feasibility study with you, to take the initial steps that might end up in an enterprise city. That enables us to tell a developer, you've got countries that are serious about this. This is not a totally speculative project. We then apply our competitiveness diagnostic and what we call our eCity simulator, which is a economic productivity tool that tells you the economic gains that can be accomplished if you have this kind of regulatory environment in place. And that's what we work with the government on, to show them for certain things that they do, this is the economic activity that can be generated. And then we negotiate with the government a regulatory framework agreement that becomes the investor proposition for the project. And that's what you take to global capital. This is not a long process. It is deliberately not a long process because we want to be able to say to global capital that there is an investor proposition in a particular place. So the diagnostic is a 4 to 6 week process. The regulatory framework discussion is about a 6 to 8 month process. And then, and this is just another way of looking at it, once you're done, so in about a year you have the investor proposition agreed. Now it can be any number of things. It can be very, very limited, or it can be a very extensive change in the regulatory environment, and that depends on the country. So the way we talk to countries about this is you look at a 10 square kilometer new greenfield site that you're building anyway. What could you do there? You could do a real estate project, you could do a free trade zone, you could do some of these other things. Let's say that's a $500 million project. What if you took the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index and you made it easy to register a business? You made it easy to register a mortgage. You basically covered those kinds of things. What would happen? What would be the change in the economic activity as a result of that? And our economic analysis and our productivity simulator suggests that actually, interestingly, the productivity gains are not very significant of doing that, which is interesting because Prime Minister Modi and others are focused like lasers on doing business index, registration of property. The more distorted your market is, and India is a very distorted market, the smaller the gains for just doing that. Why is that? Because all the barriers are in the higher level areas, or in the actual regulatory framework. So what's the second thing you could do? You might do some regulatory autonomy. You might open up foreign investment in certain sectors. You might have better insolvency rules. You know, Dubai is a great example of a lot of things. There's one area it's not a great example of, and that's insolvency. If you go bankrupt in Dubai, you go to jail. So this is not a great incentive for entrepreneurial activity. So insolvency rules are critical to creating that kind of economic activity. What does that do? Well, our simulator suggests that that might take a $500 million project and make it a $1 billion project. There are significant gains from doing this. And then eCity 3 is the full enterprise city with a totally pro-competitive regulatory environment, having optimized the environment and made it competitive, dealt with all the issues and all the problems that people typically complain about in countries, lack of access to financial capital, which you solve through competitive financial services systems, lowering the cost of the cost of an inflexible labor market by having a more flexible labor market, lowering telecom costs by having a more competitive telecoms environment. That can be north of $5 billion. I mean, that's where the huge, huge gains actually are. Just a quick word on our productivity simulator. This is something we've been developing inside Babson for some time. We work with a number of faculty on this. We are very, very proud of this tool. We're presenting this at the Legatum Foundation in June. It is the first economic simulator like this of its kind. It is far more accurate than things like the World Economic Forum global competitiveness indicators. We've largely because of the way we have built it, and I can talk to people in the break or at lunch about how we've done it. But to give you a sense of accuracy, the World Economic Forum global competitiveness indicators are 19% accurate, which means that they predict GDP movements of countries based on these indicators 19% of the time, which is actually, sounds bad, but it's actually quite good. Our simulator regressed back to all the GDP movements in the world is 90% accurate. So we have some publications that we've already done on it, and we'll have more, but we think that's a real path-breaking development. And it's done because we've maximized the role of competition in these indicators. Competition, we believe, is one of the most powerful forces for liberating the entrepreneurial spirit, for liberating economic activity, and for generating consumer welfare, and economic activity. So every country has an e-city curve. I talked about the control and the e-city 1 being the World Bank stuff, e-city 2 being this limited version, e-city 3 being the full thing. Every country has a curve like this. And so when we talk to governments, we're simply saying to them, look, you want to be somewhere on this curve. And this is, again, part of the ETA aspect of this project. We're not saying to them, you must be Enterprise City 3, otherwise we're not doing the project. What we're saying to them is, you figure out where you are comfortable being, because you have to do some things to get the huge economic gains. When I first met with the Minister of Commerce in Morocco, he understood this immediately. Because I was saying to him, look, you don't have to do everything, you can do a very limited project, you can phase it over time, and he replied immediately, but if we don't do everything, we're not going to get the gains. And I said, yeah, that's right. If you don't do everything, you won't get the gains. So you have to determine where you are. So we make it easy for governments to do this. Because many of these reforms are things that governments want to do anyway. They want to do them on a nationwide basis. They find them very hard to do on a nationwide basis. So here's another way of looking at some of the gains from the different kinds of enterprise cities that you can have. And this is something we presented to the Moroccan government. We actually have just come back from Morocco. We presented a feasibility study in detail to the Moroccan government, and we've shown them what is the economic gain in all of these different areas. So, for example, you look at the air hub. What do you need? Morocco should be an air hub for Africa and Southern Europe. It isn't. Why isn't it? Because Royal Air Maroc is an incumbent airline that prevents anyone from competing with them. So, what do you need to do to be an air hub? Well, you need to have pro-competitive slot allocation. There's the slots, the landing slots that airlines come in on. You need to have more degrees of air freedom. Well, if you do those things, this is the kind of air hub you can create. You can create a $1.2 billion air hub. But if you don't do these things, then you're down to 200 million or less. So all of these different areas, financial services, what do you need to do to have a real viable financial services hub? You need to open up competition in the banking sector. You need to open up competition in the insurance sector, which is very closed in many, many markets. Maritime hub. You know, many countries have very draconian foreign flag carrier rules, crew nationality rules, all of these things. Well, interestingly, in Morocco, in Tanger Med, they've already eliminated some of these things. They've eliminated the foreign flag carrier rule, they've eliminated the crew requirement, but they have certain other things that are still holding up growth in Tanger Med that we can actually help them with. Energy production is a huge, huge area in developing markets where the cost of energy is staggeringly high. It's staggeringly high because you have uncompetitive regulatory environments in energy, often run by government state-owned companies that have no incentives to actually produce better services and lower the cost. So for example, in a project we're doing in the Dominican Republic, the cost of energy is 5 times what it is in Mexico. Not what it is in the US, 5 times what it is in Mexico. So it's very difficult. The energy cost is part of everything. Everything you sell, everything you make, energy cost is part of it. So if your energy cost is very high, you're going to be uncompetitive around the world. So we have a number of products that we talk to governments about. We've broken those down. So we can actually talk to governments or developers just to do the feasibility study, just to do the competitiveness indicator. We can talk to city developers, mayors, industrial zones. One of the problems industrial zones have is that they are very limited in their ability to generate real activity because they're all driven on tax breaks, so we can improve that. What do the governments get as a result of this? Well, obviously, they get an economic engine in the country, which is the most significant thing, but we also have a revenue share with government, and interestingly, based on the panel that just preceded us, we have a revenue share that goes into a trust for healthcare and education, because healthcare and education are the primary barriers in generating economic activity. And so in Morocco, where we've just done the study, an Enterprise City 3, the fully realized project, gives you a 3.14% GDP injection into the Moroccan economy, creates 100,000 jobs and lifts 600,000 people out of poverty. So here are some of the companies we're working with in our development council. These are companies that are engaged already in the building of new cities, smart cities, enterprise cities. We have an academic council. Many Babson professors are on our academic council and work with us, and people from outside Babson, because obviously this is a real huge project that we want to engage the Academy in everywhere. So I'll stop there. I know we are time sensitive, so.
Well, thank you so much, Shanker. This is a complicated project, so I think it's great to hear from you originally. Yeah. And now we'll hear briefly about the financial side of these sorts of transactions, but then I'd love to have time for us to open it up and have a conversation as a community about how people might view these projects.
Sure.
Thank you.
I just want to make sure, can you hear me in the back? All right. And I must apologize to begin with because my schedule is very tight, unfortunately, and I won't be able to stay for long after the presentation. I apologize in advance. I've been so honored to be here with you all this weekend. I'm honored to be part of this community and inspired just to learn what everybody's up to, how you pursue your passions and your business and how you're out to make a difference in the world. My contact information will be on the slide at the end, so if you have any thoughts, red flags, ideas, please reach out. And if not, Cesar, do you mind standing up for a second? Cesar works with us, so if you see him around, feel free to reach out to him as well. He'll have a card. So, depending where you're listening from, as Shanker was giving his presentation talking about enterprise cities and how that can change the world and unleash the power of entrepreneurship, depending where you're sitting and listening from, that might sound like a very big, unlikely, and perhaps even impossible undertaking, although it's happened in many ways around the world. So I just want us to be honest for a second. How many of you are a little skeptical that such a large undertaking is viable in the short term? Show your hands, be proud. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So consider that almost everything that's been worth it in the world was at some point first declared impossible. Not hard, not difficult, impossible. And consider that ultimately the job of the entrepreneur is to convert what the world considers as impossible, not viable, into actually being possible. And the power of doing that goes beyond the immediate return on an investment that might ensue from creating a paint that didn't exist before, or whatever undertaking you're after. The transformative power of really doing something that hadn't been done before is tremendous. As an example, in 10 days, it will be 61 years since Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile for the first time ever in history. And up until that time, people thought it was impossible. There are just some physical limitations. Cheetahs run faster than humans, and you'll never run as fast as a cheetah. And running a 4-minute mile was just impossible. And in 1954, Roger Bannister broke that record for the first time. It had never been done before. And after he broke the record, 46 days later, someone else broke the record. And since then, up until now, about 26,000 people have broken the record. And doing a 4-minute mile is today the standard of performance if you want to be considered a serious potential Olympian. So from all history, impossible, to now being the standard of performance just to be considered, that's the power of doing something for the first time and transforming what was considered to be impossible to be possible. So I want you to consider also that at the core of most innovations, at the core of most of the things out there that we today sometimes take for granted and consider extremely valuable and a source of wealth, there's entrepreneurship at the core. There's risk and reward, there is the gathering of resources and making it work somehow, and there is always an individual and a team behind that making it happen. Consider that entrepreneurship, the action of being an entrepreneur, is a very human thing to do. To pursue your dreams, to really trade with each other, be in society. At the core, being an entrepreneur is something that's very human. But it is something that happens at scale within a certain context. And we know this. I'm from Venezuela, and the context there is certainly not conducive to entrepreneurship at scale. And there are many countries around the world that have gone through cycles, and I don't need to go into details, but the context is absolutely impactful. And consider what can happen when, as Shanker was talking, the context for entrepreneurship to flourish is not a side conversation. It's not something that hopefully we improve marginally upon. But when the context becomes the focus, when change in that context becomes the new standard of performance, if you're going to build a new city in the world, what would that do to our world? What would it do when you unleash the power of human potential through entrepreneurship, not as a side thing, but as the focus, and let everything else happen? Now, that context is a context where people are free to pursue their dreams, where they get to keep the fruits of their labors, where they get to compete on the merits. And that, I think you'll find, is very much at the core of what Shanker has put together with the Enterprise Cities Project and Babson. So just briefly about me as I close. I come from a native country where most of the population was poor. And I went to Babson because I wanted to make a difference. And I thought from the beginning, by seeing the types of people who had gone to Babson and had tremendous success in life, that there must be something there about being an entrepreneur and having an impact. I started my career in finance. I've done my fair share of entrepreneurship with some failures, some successes, but it's been a tremendous journey along the way. And my focus now is NeWAY private capital, which is what the president was mentioning. And I'm very bullish about Enterprise Cities. It's one of our focuses right now. We are primarily a venture capital firm, if you will, and we also manage some nonprofit capital. But Enterprise Cities, I think it's amazingly exciting, has the power to transform the world, and I'm so proud to be part of it in my limited capacity. And I think that if you look at Enterprise Cities as an entrepreneur would, as we are, you should think about a space, an opportunity, where it's almost a perfect scenario ready to be disrupted. What it means to have a regulatory framework such as the one of an enterprise city. There is basically an essential and unelastic need. Everybody needs the type of services we normally associate with government. The size of the market is the world. It is a highly concentrated industry where the top 5% of the providers have over 70% of the market share. They're bureaucratic. In fact, they are the definition of what it means to be bureaucratic. And it is extremely inefficient in it that, by and large, the vast majority of the providers lose money. And so you have also an unsatisfied customer base, which have become increasingly unsatisfied. And as Shanker just mentioned, there is a macroeconomic condition with urbanization trends, government deficits, and sideline private capital that, as an entrepreneur, if you look at this from that point of view, you're saying it's not only not impossible, it is the perfect storm to disrupt this industry, the largest in the world, with huge potential to have a meaningful impact. And when you look at it as an investor, as I look at it, you think that this is the typical risk-reward matrix. The more risk you take, the more reward you would expect. And to the far right is the type of venture capital investments that we're making, where the risk is that you lose everything, and the upside is that potentially you get 100 times return on your investment. The way that the investment vehicles are being set up, given the real estate nature of them, have limited risk because there's always something solid there. Land can go down in value, and it does, but it will never go down to zero the same way that a technology startup does. But the upside is probably similar, if not larger, than that of the type of investments we make in venture capital. And a lot has been said here in this forum about having an impact. Conscious capitalism is a term that was used, but I think at the core is about really making a difference, contributing beyond just the return on investment, although I think that's great in and of itself. But when you think about what the power of enterprise cities is, and you think about, by changing the context and unleashing human potential, the impact that that has, and then the reach it can have, literally, not only in the city itself, but as serving as a demonstrative case, so that what happened with the 4-minute mile becomes a standard in how cities are built going forward. If that's what you're interested in, this has amazing potential. So there are some parallels in how we think about financing early stage companies in a very stage-by-stage basis. I won't go into much detail because we're limited in time, but I just wanted to say I'm so honored to be part of this. I think that it is a big undertaking, but if there's ever been something I've seen out there that's definitely worth it, this is one of those things. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. So thank you, Shanker and Eric. I think you have packed in more information in a short period of time than I have ever seen actually presented. So now let's try to unpack it a little bit and answer some of the questions that must be brewing out in the audience. Let's ask you, do you have questions for them about this project, about why they're enthusiastic about it? Do you challenge their assumptions? What are you thinking out there? I saw some skeptics earlier. Yes, Oriana.
It is fantastic. It is like cutting edge and it's exciting. However, my question if you see a project such as the one we saw yesterday for building entrepreneurial ecosystems and you see your project, what are the synergies that you see and in which points is completely different?
Okay. If I could jump in and to start, and then I'll send it actually off to the panelists. When I saw the entrepreneurial ecosystem project and Shanker's project, I almost saw them as flip sides of the same coin. I saw that with the entrepreneurial ecosystem project like we did in Manizales, that we were taking an existing system and trying to retrofit it and trying to adjust the attitude of government toward how they should be treating entrepreneurs, including regulation. But that was a part of trying to adjust an existing system. Here, we're looking at entirely greenfield sites, and it's almost like imagining what would be perfect and trying to reach that perfection. But Shanker, how do you think about these things?
That's a great question. I think, so I'll answer it in sort of 2 or 3 different ways. One is that in the entrepreneurial ecosystem project, so Dan is building on an existing regulatory framework. So one of his projects.
Have a phone near the, is there a phone nearby?
Let's do that. A lot of the projects that Dan works on are in places like Denmark and Milwaukee and so on. So you have an existing regulatory infrastructure, and he and I have talked about the Colombia project, maybe the sort of middle one, the overlapping project. Our work is focused on those places where the regulatory barriers, the legal, economic governance barriers are most extreme, which is where you see, which is primarily emerging markets, developing countries. So our projects are in places like the Dominican Republic. Mexico is, so again, one of those sort of in the middle. Morocco, we have a project in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, Bosnia, these kinds of places where there's massive barriers, where you can't build on anything. But if we're successful, and if you actually do change the regulatory environment, then Dan's work becomes really valuable at that point, because then you can take it and put it on top of that better environment. And then, because people don't become entrepreneurial overnight. You change the regulatory environment and you make it easy for people to access capital. They don't access capital immediately. They have to learn how to do that.
Erick, as an investor, would you be interested in investing in a city that has done the sort of work that Dan Eisenberg has done in Manizales more than another city?
Well, absolutely. I think that the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, and from my understanding, what has happened in Manizales since this project was initiated is there's been a lot of transformation, a lot of energy going into it, and whenever you have that and you have enthusiasm and capital comes in and ideas and innovation, there are plenty investment opportunities, and it need not just be in the ventures themselves. I think the ecosystem has multiple forms and vehicles through which, as an investor, you can contribute, whether it's real estate or otherwise.
Yeah, so I think the answer, Oriana, is that these aren't either-or scenarios. We view them either as complementary or applying to different situations entirely. Other questions? Joe. Joe can ask his questions anytime, but he can't do it in front of a forum usually. So here we go. Do we have a microphone available? Here it comes. Sorry, that one wasn't working. Here we go.
Shanker, I think most of us are familiar with the World Bank, ease of business surveys, and the criteria and the places you've been talking about rank very highly on those, so there must be some compatibility with your, I think you've taken it to another level in some way. So it makes sense, I think, it's almost proven science what you're doing. How do you plan, if you're successful, besides the financial impact of a wholly owned subsidiary benefiting from what you do profitability-wise, how do you think Babson College, how will Babson College benefit from being associated with your endeavor here? How do you bring it back to the college in your model going forward?
That's also a great question. I think you're seeing two things around the world, and most of my answer is going to relate to intellectual capital and intellectual benefit, because as you said, the financial benefit is one thing, but the bigger benefit, I think, is really the intellectual capital. And the entrepreneurship world in general, I was the keynote speaker at the Global Entrepreneurship, or a keynote plenary speaker at the Global Entrepreneurship Congress in Milan this year. And in the Global Entrepreneurship Summit in Marrakesh in Morocco, where we were both at, there is an increased discussion about how you build entrepreneurial cities, and the notion of the city as a key element of entrepreneurial thinking is becoming, every entrepreneurship conference is now featuring a cities panel and so on. So I think this is space we need to occupy, because if we don't occupy it, somebody else is going to occupy it. And we have the perfect vehicle for doing that. And I think also in terms of the whole economic activity and the regulatory systems side of things, we're creating a lot of academic output with our Academic Advisory Council, papers, books, articles that are really cutting edge articles and books and research streams. So I think there's a huge research component that is very, very valuable. And it's, you'll get it, as with anything, when you get in on the ground floor of a new activity and you're building a whole area, you're building a whole practice, as Babson is in this area, the founders are going to basically determine what the area is and will benefit from the academic.
And we're not the only college or university that's interested in this area right now. So we have a number of other institutions that are leading institutions in the field.
Right. So Stern in New York is doing things on this, MIT, Harvard. I mean, a lot of people are engaged in this space. And one of the reasons I'm very confident that this is going to happen is that when lots of people together come to an idea independently, that's usually a sign that the idea's time has come. And I think that's what's happened here. So we're a prime player in it right now. I think we have to remain, pushing the envelope, pushing the academic envelope. And then the returns to the college, I think, are going to be very significant.
If
yes,
I may, while I was at Babson as a student and Venezuela was going through what it was going through, there was a moment in time in which my family was faced with quite a difficult situation. And Babson had to step in, and they literally created a lending facility that didn't exist to make sure I could stay, and I'm forever grateful for that. My firm, insofar as we might continue to be involved, and hopefully there is great profits to be made, we stand ready to make a meaningful pledge into the Babson endowment. I've mentioned this from the very beginning when I became involved. The details of that need to be defined, because the project itself and the financial engineering, as you can imagine, it's not plain vanilla. But I think that as there's wealth creation and there's a simple brand association, if nothing else, formal or no formal pledges, I think there's tremendous tangible value that will for sure go back into the college. And I can speak for ourselves, but I can guarantee you that.
And Shanker, sometimes you talk about these projects as living laboratories. To Joe's question about what's the value to the college, how would you see our college actually interacting with some of these projects that you and Eric might be involved with?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are living laboratories, and the opportunities for students to study them, for students to be engaged with them, is tremendous. And in fact, one of the things I've been most pleased about since I came here was the level of student engagement on these projects. Generally, when we talk to groups of international students, and Kerry and I have spent a lot of time talking to groups of international students, the reaction is, wow, this is amazing, how can I get involved with this? And the reaction is usually, how can I bring this to my country? And with the Babson, and this is unique to Babson, the type of student body that we have is actually able to make good on that statement. Now, that's not the case in a lot of places. But I mean, Martin is a wonderful example in Colombia of somebody who did exactly that. He said, how can I bring this to my country? Let me get involved. And then is actually fully engaged with us on doing that. So I think student engagement is a huge part of this.
So we have a question down front.
Can you hear me? Okay, now it's working. So it seems like networking is the word, or is the magic word to spread your program. How easy, how far have you gone within the world to different countries? Do you have examples? What countries are you working with right now? What presidents are you talking to? And I hope you can go all over the place, but how difficult has it been to go up to certain countries and try to spread the word with your program, about your program,
right.
market your program?
Right. So I joined Babson, let's see, in September of 2013. So a bit over a year. When we came, we had the tentative beginnings of one project in the Dominican Republic, and we signed that, shortly after I arrived. We now have about 13 negotiations with 13 different countries. We're working on the redevelopment of the Puerto Rico Roosevelt Roads naval base. We have a project in Mexico, as I said, Morocco, Bosnia, Saudi Arabia. We're talking to the Omanis about the Dukan Port Authority. India with two cities, one gift city in Gujarat, and the other is the new city that's been created by Andhra Pradesh, the state in India. And we're also talking to the Indonesians about a project. But the answer to so we're in a lot of places and we're all around the world. But the answer to your question is really, you have to seed local champions. You have to have people in countries who are enthused about the idea, who are passionate about seeing the level of economic growth, poverty alleviation, creation of jobs and opportunity and hope for people. And you have to work with people like that who want to deliver the project themselves. And some of our champions are in government, some of them are in the private sector, some of them are all over the place. But we have to have those. And there's a whole ecosystem of those people. And it's, Babson students who are, in all of these countries that want these projects to take off and are passionate themselves. Government officials who have tried to do reform and have seen how difficult it is. They are the best champions for us.
I see an e-cities expert teed up for the next question here. So, Pedro.
No, I'm certainly not an e-cities expert, sorry. But hi, everybody. One of the things that I think we should take into consideration, I think it's a wonderful project. I think that in as much as we are successful in e-cities, I think we are empowering the population of each country. And in that effect, we're taking power away, with all due respect to politicians. Mm-hmm. And I think it's high time that the private sector is able to put their stamp on a country in a way that the politicians have to come and see if the private sector is in tune with what they're doing. And it will create a great balance of power. Because unfortunately, Eric, you've gone through this. What happened in Venezuela? Mm-hmm. So if we go back 20 years and we set up an e-city in Venezuela, what would it be worth today? Mm-hmm. Zero. And Dominican Republic, you see it in Colombia, you see it in Mexico. Mm-hmm. We've had great politicians for the last 12 years. We have a shift, and now we go back to what I think is corruption. And so, unfortunately, in Latin America, what we face is the volatility of the political system, which we're not able to control. We are, as Latin American entrepreneurs, at their beck and calling. So your business can be worth $10 or it can be worth $1 million overnight. And that's the big challenge we have. Babson's role, I think, is fascinating. I think the whole concept is great. But I think that what Jay was Professor Jay was talking about yesterday, there's risks and there's uncertainties. Mm-hmm. And I think here we have two of those variables that we have to learn to live with. But I think the concept itself is very valuable, and I think the participation, Eric, of you is incredible, Shanker, and obviously Babson with President Keeley. So all the best to you, and hopefully we can all help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me just say one real quick thing. Okay. So that sort of creates another question, which is, the nature of the investor proposition. You have to be able, and this is a conversation we have with governments, I just had it with the Moroccans. If you don't do enough of this, if you don't create the kind of carrots and sticks in the regulatory framework that investors will actually believe in and trust, you are not going to be successful. So our challenge is, one, to create an environment that is better than anywhere else. That's actually that's not rocket science, that's easier to do. The biggest challenge is what you just said. The $65 million question is, can you convince investors, like Hong Kong did with their regulatory framework, that it won't be changed by a future government? That's the whole game right there.
Well, on that actually very thoughtful note, I would like to conclude not only this session, but actually our entire conference, with the exception of our wonderful luncheon celebration. And I was very interested in what you said, Pedro, because my own personal journey to Babson was from government, from being a politician, to coming to Babson, the very source for entrepreneurship. And my motivation in doing that was that when I was in government, I saw that government could not fix the problems, that we were not the answer. We were necessary, but we couldn't actually make the changes necessary to lift people out of poverty, to answer their social needs, and to create jobs. And so once I left government, I did a number of things. One of them was to start a television show which focused on people who are doing the kinds of scientific and social innovation and social entrepreneurship necessary to actually change society. And so when I had the opportunity to come to Babson, I was thrilled to be able to come and start engaging with the people who are going to change the world and who are changing the world and who actually have those tools at hand. So I want to thank you all for being a member of this wonderful community, for coming together to share our experiences and our fellowship. And I hope that you will continue to follow this troop around the world. I hope to see you all in Dubai in another year. And I hope to see you all at Babson for our centennial in 2019. It's a wonderful place, and it will be a wonderful celebration wherever we go, as long as you all are there. Thank you so much for hosting us here.